I am Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Associate Professor of Literature. We're back to work. Last week was what it was. I have nothing further to add on to the subject of last week. And I would ask that you extend me the professional courtesy of proceeding on the same basis. There are people in my department. I will not name the people nor the department. I have been asked not to name the people nor the department, which is in itself a communication I find instructive. There are people in my department who have sent me emails about last week that I have read, filed, and will not be responding to. The emails exist. The emails have been noted. We are moving on. We are here to examine F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published 1925. It is a novel that has been taught in secondary schools with such aggressive regularity for so many consecutive decades that the critical sediment deposited on top of it has become at this point geologically significant. I want to begin by addressing that sediment directly, because what I'm going to argue today depends on your willingness to set down what you think you already know and what you think you already know about The Great Gatsby is, I want to be precise about this, not wrong in the way that a factual error is wrong. It is wrong in a more interesting way. It is wrong in the way that a misread signal is wrong, coherent, internally consistent, producing meaning with apparent confidence, and pointing in entirely the wrong direction. You have been, most of your reading lives, performing the novel's central argument without knowing it. My thesis is this. The Great Gatsby is a novel about the failure of communication. Every signal in it misfires. Every message either fails to transmit, fails to arrive, or arrives as something other than what was sent. The green light is not a symbol of hope. It is not the American dream. The green light is just a signal that nobody in the novel reads correctly, including the man sending it, and the critical tradition that has spent a century calling it beautiful has been, with great feeling and great consistency, making Gatsby's own mistake. We shall proceed. I want to spend some time with the received reading before I dismantle it, because the received reading has a logic, and the logic is worth examining. The green light sits at the end of Daisy's dock. Gatsby reaches toward it across the water. Nick watches him reach. The image is arresting, genuinely, almost unbearably arresting, and the reading it produces is approximately this. Gatsby reaches toward what he cannot have, toward the past he cannot recover, toward the dream that recedes the moment you approach it, and the green light is the emblem of that reaching, of that longing, of that specifically American condition of wanting more than the world will give you. It is a reading of great emotional force. It has been handed to 15-year-olds for 70, 80 years, and they have received it, and it has produced in them, many of them, a genuine and lasting response to the novel. And I am not particularly here to tell them that their response was false. The response was real. The reading was a misreading, and the misreading was real. And the fact that the novel produced real feeling through a misreading is, I want to suggest, not incidental to what the novel is doing. It is the novel doing it to you. You reached toward the green light and thought you understood it, and what you understood was not what Fitzgerald transmitted. And this is precisely and structurally what happens to every character in the book. It happened to you, and it happens to every character in the book. Fitzgerald has been performing his thesis on his readership for a century, and the readership has been the proof of his thesis for just as long, and I find this, when I sit with it, to be extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary. And I found it on a Tuesday at a reasonable hour, having slept perfectly well, and I want to be clear that the experience was entirely different from last week, which, again, we are not discussing. The error in the received reading is not in its emotional register. The error is simply grammatical. The received reading treats the green light as a symbol, which is to say, it treats it as a static object that produces meaning by standing for something else. So we say hope stands behind it, the dream stands behind it, the past stands behind it. The light is beautiful and unattainable, and what it means is that beautiful things are unattainable when this is sad and this is America. Fine. This is a perfectly adequate piece of symbolic reading, and it is what you do with an image when you have been trained to ask what images mean. The question I want to ask is different and prior. Before we ask what the green light means, I want to ask what it is doing. Because the green light in The Great Gatsby is not primarily an image, it is an action. He's not contemplating it. Gatsby's using it. It has a purpose. He is directing himself toward it across the water with the sustained intentionality of a man sending a message. And the question that the received reading has never adequately asked, the question I'm asking today here, with the evidence that I'm about to lay out for you, is whether the message arrives. Whether anyone on the other side of the water is receiving. Whether Daisy in her white house, with her white dresses and her voice full, whatever her voice is full of, is reading the signal that has been directed at her from across the bay for 5 years. The answer, which I'm going to prove to you section by section over the course of this analysis, is no. Well, the answer is that nobody in this novel reads anything correctly. The answer is that The Great Gatsby is not a novel about longing. It is a novel about the systematic, structural, and in several cases fatal failure of human beings to transmit meaning to one another. And the green light is not its symbol, it's simply the first piece of evidence. So, to understand why the communication fails, we must first understand the instrument through which all of the novel's communication reaches us, because this is where Fitzgerald's architecture is most precise and most consistently under-examined. Nick Carraway narrates The Great Gatsby in the retrospective first person. He was there. He tells us what happens. He is famously, at one point, one of the few honest people he has ever known. He tells us this himself with an equanimity that should stop every reader cold, and largely has not. The claim to honesty has been received generally as Fitzgerald's signal to us that Nick is trustworthy, or at a minimum as an irony so broad that it serves as its own disclaimer. What it actually is, and this is where the communication framework becomes essential to my reading, is the novel's first and most perfect demonstration of a receiver who cannot read the signals he is receiving about himself. Nick transmits a message, I am honest. Nick receives that message as transmitted by himself and decodes it as I am honest. The signal travels zero distance and loses nothing in transmission and arrives exactly as sent, and yet it is completely wrong. This is not ordinary, unreliable narration. Ordinary, unreliable narration gives us a narrator who distorts consciously or unconsciously, who has interests that shape his telling, who is compromised by proximity or feeling. Nick is something more structurally specific than this. Nick is a receiver with distorted calibration. His equipment is often ways he cannot detect, because the detection equipment is the same equipment that is off. He misreads signals throughout the novel about Gatsby, about Daisy, about Tom, about Jordan, about his own responses to all of them. And he presents each misreading as clear reception. So he's not lying. He's not, even in the ordinary sense, deceiving himself. He is decoding faithfully yet incorrectly, which is the most consequential kind of misreading because it is the kind that the reader cannot easily detect. And of course, the narrator cannot correct. For example, consider the specific texture of Nick's narration and what it does to the information it carries. He arrives in West Egg with what he describes as a genuine openness, a willingness to reserve judgment, and this openness is structurally his most significant liability. A receiver calibrated toward reception without skepticism will receive everything that is transmitted to it, including the noise. Nick receives Gatsby's performance of himself and decodes it as character. He receives Tom's brutality and decodes it as energy. He receives Daisy's charm and decodes it as depth. I could continue. In each case, he is receiving a transmission accurately. The signal is getting through and decoding it according to a set of values and assumptions that produce the wrong output. The problem is not the transmission, and it is not the reception in the mechanical sense. The problem is the code book, because Nick and the people around him do not share a code, and he does not know this, and the novel's entire account of what happens at West Egg in the summer of 1922 is therefore the account of a man who was present for everything and yet understood nothing. Of course, rendered in a prose of such beauty and apparent precision that the reader experiences it as clarity. Fitzgerald has perhaps built a window that looks like glass, yet is actually a mirror, and the view it offers is of the person looking through it. And Nick spends the novel looking through it, reporting what he sees on the other side, and of course what he sees on the other side is Nick. He sees himself. This is not, I want to emphasize, this is not a simple point about narrative unreliability. Every undergraduate who has spent 20 minutes with Wayne Booth knows about unreliable narrators. What I am arguing is something more structural and more specific. That Fitzgerald has designed Nick's unreliability to enact the novel's thesis, rather than merely to complicate its testimony. Nick's not unreliable as a narrative convenience. Nick is unreliable as a demonstration. He shows us by example what the novel argues by analysis, that the gap between transmission and reception is not bridged by honesty or proximity or intelligence or good faith. Nick has all these things, in his estimation, largely in ours, and yet the gap is not bridged. He stands at the centre of the summer's events, closer to Gatsby than almost anyone, present at the party, the hotel room, the accident, the pool, when what he transmits to us is a novel's worth of decoded signals, and the decoding is wrong, and the prose is beautiful. And the wrongness and the beauty are the same thing, and Fitzgerald knew this and built it. And it has been sitting in the novel's first chapter since 1925, in the sentence about Nick being one of the few honest people he has ever known, waiting for the reader who would ask not whether Nick is honest, but what honesty has to do with the ability, or rather inability, to receive a signal correctly. The answer which the novel provides with increasing precision as it proceeds is nothing. Honesty is a property of transmission. It says something about what a sender intends to communicate. Honesty says nothing about whether the receiver's equipment is calibrated to decode it. Nick is, in his transmission, honest. In his reception, he is as compromised as everyone else in the novel, more compromised than some, because his confidence in his own calibration is absolute. And absolute confidence in one's calibration is the condition that makes recalibration impossible. He will leave at the end of the novel having received everything and understood almost nothing. And he will write it down in beautiful sentences, and we will read it, and we will call it a great American novel. We will be right, but we'll also be enacting the novel's argument as we do so. And Fitzgerald will have been dead for 80 years or more, and the thesis will still be proving itself on us. And I find this in the specific way that I find certain pieces of structural precision almost intolerably elegant. I want to place Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's eyes at the center of this analysis, because they are where Fitzgerald is most explicit about what he is doing, and where the critical tradition has most thoroughly looked directly at the argument and produced a different argument in its place. The eyes are enormous. They look out from a faded billboard over the Valley of Ashes, behind spectacles that have no face beneath them, and they see everything within their field of vision, and they do nothing with what they see. George Wilson, in the extremity of his grief, looks at them and says, God sees everything. The critical tradition and the extremity of its investment in Fitzgerald as a moral novelist has largely followed Wilson's lead. The eyes of God, or the absence of God, or the death of the spiritual in a materialist age, or the judgment that nobody in this novel is receiving because nobody in the novel is looking upward. These are readings of genuine sophistication, and they are, by the standard of the argument I'm making today, demonstrations of exactly what they claim to describe. The critical tradition has looked at Eckelberg and manufactured meaning from the looking, from their own looking, just as Wilson does, just as Nick does, just as every character in the novel does, when confronted with a signal they cannot decode. The eyes are not God. The eyes are not the absence of God. The eyes are, as all eyes are, a receiver. They are Fitzgerald's image of what reception without comprehension looks like when you give it a face, or rather the equipment of a face, the eyes, the spectacles, the forward orientation, but without the apparatus that converts reception into meaning. So we could say Eckelberg receives every signal that passes through the Valley of Ashes. The ash falls, the grey men move through it, Tom's car passes, Myrtle runs into the road, the yellow car does not stop. Eckelberg receives all of it with perfect fidelity and produces nothing. No judgment, no meaning, no decoded message, just the ongoing, unblinking, perfectly calibrated reception of a receiver that has no codebook. Wilson looks at Eckelberg and says God sees everything, and this is the novel's most concentrated example of what happens when a receiver encounters a signal it cannot decode. It generates meaning from its own interior, rather than from the transmission. Wilson is not reading Eckelberg. Wilson is projecting onto Eckelberg, using the billboard as a surface for his own grief and his own need for cosmic accountability. And the billboard receives his projection with the same blank fidelity with which it receives everything else. I'm not being critical of Wilson. Wilson's in agony. Wilson's just watched his wife die on the road. The meaning making is not a failure of faith or intelligence or moral seriousness. We're talking about a fundamental human response to a signal that cannot be decoded, which is to supply the decoding from within. We do this. Every reader of this novel has done this. Every critic who has written about Eckelberg as the eye of God has done this. Fitzgerald designed the image to produce exactly this response and then embedded in the image the evidence that the response is a projection rather than a reception, and the evidence has been there since 1925 in the blankness behind the spectacles, in the absence of a face, in the fact that the eyes are painted on a billboard that is itself fading, that was itself an advertisement for a business that no longer exists, that is itself a transmission from a sender who has long since stopped sending. The signal is dead. The receiver is perfect. the meaning is yours. I want to draw out one further implication of Eckelberg before we move on, because it bears directly on the novel's geographical argument, which I will address more fully, but just want to plant here. Eckelberg presides over the Valley of Ashes, not over West Egg, not over East Egg, not over New York. The Valley of Ashes is the space between, the space that is neither the origin of the signal nor its intended destination, the dead ground that transmission must cross to get from one shore to the other. Fitzgerald deliberately places his image of reception without comprehension in the dead ground. He puts his blind receiver in the space between the transmitter and the intended audience, which is precisely where a receiver placed in the channel, rather than at its end, would function. Eckelberg is not watching the story from above. Eckelberg is in the channel. Eckelberg is what the signal passes through on its way from Gatsby's dock to Daisy's house. And what it passes through is a receiver that produces nothing. And this is where the ash is, and this is where Myrtle dies, and this is where Wilson stands with his grief and his projection and his gun. And Fitzgerald put all of this here in the channel between the transmitter and the receiver, because the channel is where the failure lives, and he wanted you to see it. And Eckelberg's eyes have been watching you not see it for 100 years. The geography, the novel itself, placement, is not incidental to its argument. It's not been read with sufficient precision. The Valley of Ashes sits between West Egg and New York, which is to say it sits between the place where Gatsby's signal originates and the place where the signal's interference is most acute. East Egg sits across the bay from West Egg, which is to say the intended receiver of Gatsby's transmission lives on the opposite shore, separated from the transmitter by a body of water that is narrow enough to see across and wide enough that what you see across it is a light rather than a person. Fitzgerald's geography is a diagram, spatial representation of the conditions of transmission in the novel. The transmitter and receiver are close enough to see each other, too far apart to hear, separated by water that distorts and a valley that kills and a city that interferes, and the whole system is presided over by a dead advertisement. The green light is visible from Gatsby's dock because the water is narrow. It is unreadable because everything else about the geography ensures that the signal cannot travel the distance intact. West Egg and East Egg are not social categories with geographical expression. Consider them as the novel's transmitter and receiver, and the novel's transmitter and receiver are separated by exactly the conditions required to guarantee that the signal fails. What I want to establish here is the distinction between proximity and connection, which the geography enforces and the characters consistently fail to make. Nick lives next door to Gatsby. He can see Gatsby's house from his own. He attends Gatsby's parties. He facilitates the reunion with Daisy. He is, in terms of physical proximity to Gatsby's transmission, closer than anyone in the novel. And what this proximity produces is not connection, but the illusion of connection, which is more destructive than distance because it prevents the search for a functioning channel. Nick believes he understands Gatsby because he's close to Gatsby, and this belief is the precise error that the novel's geography is designed to expose. So, proximity is not reception. Being in the room where the signal is transmitted does not mean your equipment is calibrated to receive it. He's next door to Gatsby for an entire summer, and what Nick receives is a performance, and he decodes the performance as a person. And the person he decodes is not Gatsby. And Gatsby, the actual transmitted signal, the same thing that James Gatz built and aimed across the water, goes the whole novel without a single accurate receiver. The geography puts everyone close together and keeps them perfectly isolated. And this is not a metaphor about the alienation of modern life in the Jazz Age, although it's also that. It is a structural argument about the relationship between physical proximity and communicative connection. And the argument is that there is no relationship, and the Valley of Ashes is its proof. And Eckelberg watches over the proof with eyes that receive everything and understand nothing. And the ash falls, and the grey men move through it, and the signal travels overhead toward East Egg, and is already failing before it clears the billboard. Now, Gatsby himself. I have been building toward Gatsby in these sections deliberately because the conventional approach, which is to begin with Gatsby, to make Gatsby the novel's center and its engine and its enigma, is itself an example of the misreading I am correcting here. Beginning with Gatsby produces the received reading, the romantic hero, the self-made man, the dream undone by the corruption of his dream. Beginning where I have begun, with the frame of the narration, with the eyes in the valley, with the geography of the channel, produces a different Gatsby. So let's talk about what this different Gatsby is. He's simply an engineer. James Gatz looked across the water at East Egg, and he did not dream about it in the passive, sentimental sense that the received reading implies. He designed a transmission system. He acquired the house and positioned it on the shore opposite Daisy's. He filled it with light and music and people and color. He constructed a persona, J. Gatsby, a name like a sound effect, a name designed to be received as old money, old ease, old certainty. And he deployed it with the precision of a man who has thought carefully about what his intended receiver is calibrated to decode. The green shirt and the parties and the pink suit and the car and the Oxford story and the old sport. These are not the affectations of a dreamer. They are the components of a transmission system built by an engineer who has studied his intended receiver with great attention and then constructed his signal accordingly. The tragedy of this engineering, genuinely, I want to be clear, the coldness of this analysis doesn't diminish what the novel produces emotionally, but rather, I would argue, intensifies it. The tragedy is that the engineering is based on a misreading of the receiver. Gatsby has studied Daisy with great attention, and what he has understood about her is the surface of her signal rather than its content. For example, he knows what she responds to aesthetically, the beauty of the house, the shirts, the parties. He's provided it. But what he cannot understand, because the channel has been closed for 5 years, and what he's been decoding is not Daisy, but his own memory of Daisy, which is a very different thing. What he does not understand is that Daisy is not calibrated to receive the signal he is sending. Daisy's receiver is tuned to a frequency that Gatsby, for all his engineering, cannot access. Not because he lacks intelligence or resources or even commitment. The frequency Daisy's receiver is tuned to is the frequency of old money, of inherited ease, of the social position that cannot be built but only born into. And this is a frequency that can be approximated but not replicated, as we see in Great Expectations. And approximation at close enough range reads as wrong rather than right. Tom hears the Oxford story and knows immediately and with contempt that it is not quite right. Daisy attends the party and finds it overwhelming, which is her receiver's response to a signal that is too close to the right frequency to ignore and too far from it to decode as genuine. Gatsby has spent 5 years building a transmission system aimed at a receiver he has never actually been close enough to read correctly. And the system is magnificent, and the signal is powerful, and the receiver is not receiving. And this is the novel's central situation. It has been there the whole time, in the engineering of the parties and the positioning of the house and the reach across the water. And the received reading has called it romantic and moved on. And I am calling it something more interesting and more precise. The word I'm using is engineering. And the reason it fails is not that dreams are fragile or the past cannot be recovered, but that Gatsby built his transmitter based on a 5-year-old decoding of a receiver that had continued, in his absence, to change its calibration. And by the time he aimed the signal across the water, the code book he was using was already far, far out of date. The parties are where this becomes most architecturally visible. And I want to spend time here because the parties have been read as excess, as decadence, as hollow glitter. And they are none of these things. Well, they are all of these things in their surface, but none of these things in their structure. The parties, again, are a broadcasting system. Gatsby has taken his house and converted it every weekend into the most powerful transmission apparatus available to him. Light blazing from every window, music carrying across the water, crowds of people whose presence signals to East Egg that something significant is happening on the opposite shore. Champagne and cocktail music, and the air alive with chatter and speculation about the host. Every element of the apparatus is calibrated. Not to overstate the point, but the lights are not decorative. They are a beacon. The music is not entertainment, it's a carrier signal. The crowds are not guests, they are amplification. I could go on. The whole system runs at full power every weekend, and it is aimed with the precision of a lighthouse across the bay at a single house, at a single recipient. And Daisy, the intended receiver, does not come. She does not come until Nick arranges it. She does not come because the broadcast is not reaching her as a signal. It is reaching her, if it's reaching her at all, it's reaching her as weather, as an ambient condition of the summer, part of the atmosphere, the season, something that happens over there, across the water, where the parties are, it just happens over there. The more powerful the broadcast, the more it reads as atmosphere rather than message. The transmission overwhelms the receiver. Gatsby has made the signal so large that it has become indistinguishable from background noise. And he stands at his dock on the nights when the parties are empty and reaches toward the green light. And the green light is the last component of the transmission system, the most direct, realistically the most intimate. One point of light aimed across the water, and it is also not being read. When Daisy finally comes to the party, when Nick has arranged the reunion and Gatsby has arranged the house, and the moment has been, in Gatsby's mind, engineered toward its intended reception, what happens? Anything but connection. What happens is Daisy's response to the party, which is to find it overwhelming, which is the word Nick gives us, which is the receiver's report on a signal that is too powerful to decode. She is not moved in the way Gatsby intends. She is moved in the way that anyone is moved by an enormous amount of directed energy. She doesn't attempt to comprehend it. She just wants to be away from it. And of course, the party overwhelms her because it is designed to overwhelm her. And the design is the flaw. The flaw was always there in the engineering, and Gatsby does not see it, and Nick does not see it, and the received reading does not see it, and I see it. And I want to be appropriately measured. Because what that means is that the evidence has been in the novel since 1925 and required only the correct framework to become visible, and the framework is mine, and I am applying it, and the party scene is under this framework, not a moment of romantic triumph undercut by the corruption of the dream, but a moment of diagnostic precision in which the novel shows us with total clarity that the transmission system Gatsby has built is not capable of producing the reception he requires, and has never been, and he is the last to know. There is one moment in The Great Gatsby where a signal transmits with perfect fidelity. One moment where a message is sent, travels the distance between sender and receiver, and arrives decoded exactly as intended. And this moment is the novel's pivot. What it reveals when you look at it through the framework I have been building is one of the most precise and devastating things Fitzgerald does in a novel that is full of precise and devastating things. The moment is when Nick's able to make the observation that Daisy's voice is full of money. So let's reconstruct the transmission chain, because the chain itself is the argument. Nick is listening to Gatsby talk about Daisy. Gatsby says something about her voice, that it's full of something, that it carries something, that the sound of it has a quality he cannot quite name. And Nick, listening to Gatsby attempt to decode Daisy's voice, supplies the decoding that Gatsby cannot reach. Her voice is full of money. This is Nick decoding Gatsby, decoding Daisy. 3 receivers in sequence, each one processing the output of the previous one, and what emerges at the end of this chain, what Nick produces when he has run Gatsby's attempted decoding through his own calibration, is not romance, not longing, not the green light, or the path, or the American dream. It's simply money. The signal at the bottom of Daisy's voice. When you strip away the romance and the beauty and the quality of inexhaustible charm, is a financial instrument. The voice is selling something. The voice has always been selling something. And Nick hears this and says it, and then moves on, because Nick's calibration is off in the specific way I described earlier. He receives the signal correctly in the mechanical sense, but he does not understand what he has received. But let us stay with what he has received, because this is where the novel's argument about communication reaches its most precise and most uncomfortable formulation. The voice full of money is the novel's only successful transmission. It is the only signal that travels from sender to receiver and arrives as sent. Daisy transmits, "I am an instrument of wealth and social position, and the ease that comes from never having had to want anything." Nick receives, "Her voice is full of money." The decoding is perfect. The transmission is flawless. And what does this one perfect transmission reveal? Well, it reveals that the signal Gatsby has been aimed at for 5 years, the signal he has built his entire apparatus to reach and win and recover, is not a person in the full sense he has invested in her. It's a frequency. It is the sound of a class position he cannot occupy, encoded in the timbre of a voice. And he has been directing his entire engineering project at that frequency for 5 years and calling it love. And Nick has decoded it correctly, accidentally, in passing, and then filed the decoding away without understanding that it is the novel's central finding. This is the pivot, because it inverts the novel's tragedy. The tragedy, as the received reading understands it, is that Gatsby cannot reach Daisy, that the dream recedes, that the past cannot be recovered, that the green light will always be across the water. The tragedy, as I am reading it, is the opposite, in a sense, that Gatsby does reach Daisy. The signal does arrive. The reunion does happen. The shirts are spread on the bed and the parties are attended. And the 5 years of engineering produce finally the reception he has been designing toward. And what reception reveals is not the consummation of the dream, but the content of the signal. And the content of the signal is money. And Gatsby cannot receive this revelation because receiving it would require him to decode his own transmission, to turn the analysis on the signal he has been sending rather than the one he has been trying to receive. And this is the one decoding the novel does not give him. He receives Daisy. He does not receive what Daisy is. He stands in the house with the shirts on the bed, and he's in the room with the thing he's been reaching toward for 5 years. And yet he's further from it than he was when he was reaching. Because proximity to Daisy without the correct codebook produces not understanding, but bewilderment. And Gatsby is bewildered. And Nick watches him be bewildered. He calls it the wonder of the moment. And the novel's most perfectly transmitted single has just told anyone with the equipment to decode it exactly what the dream is made of. And no one in the room is decoding it. And the shirts are on the bed, and Daisy is crying, and the channel is full of noise. I want to follow this observation forward into the novel's second half and watch what it produces. If Daisy's voice is full of money, and if Gatsby is reaching toward Daisy, then what Gatsby is reaching toward, what the green light encodes, what the parties broadcast, what the whole apparatus is aimed at, is not a person, not a past, and not a dream in the sentimental sense. It is a social position. It is the position of old money, of East Egg, of a kind of ease and certainty and unquestioned belonging that Tom Buchanan was born into. And Gatsby cannot buy his way into, no matter how much money he accumulates. The dream is not corrupted in the second half of the novel. The second half of the novel is what happens when the transmission arrives and the receiver finally has close enough access to the signal to read it correctly. And what reading it correctly produces is not fulfillment, but the recognition of an unbridgeable incompatibility. Gatsby cannot receive what Daisy is transmitting because what she is transmitting is a class position that his codebook cannot decode, and Daisy cannot receive what Gatsby is transmitting because he is transmitting something that is an approximation of her frequency that is close enough to produce some response and wrong enough to produce unease. And so the two of them sit across from each other in the novel's second half in a condition of perfect mutual misreception. And Tom watches, and Tom knows. I'll come to Tom, but first, briefly, I want to deal with the car. The yellow car is the novel's thesis at its most compressed, and I'm going to move through it with the efficiency that it deserves because the argument it makes is really quite simple. The simplicity is not a weakness, it's simply precision. Gatsby has a car, it's yellow, it's large, it's conspicuous. It's called by various characters the death car, which is not subtle. But Fitzgerald does not intend it to be subtle, because the car is making an explicit argument, and the argument does not require decoration. In Gatsby's intended transmission, the car encodes arrival. It says rather loudly, "I'm here. I have resources. I have crossed the distance between James Gatz and J. Gatsby. I've made it. I'm the kind of person who drives this kind of car through this kind of summer. The car is part of the apparatus, one component of the broader transmission system, and it is directed, like everything else Gatsby owns, at the project of being received as legitimate by the world across the bay. What the car actually transmits in the code that the word world receiving it uses, rather than the code Gatsby is sending it in, is everything the apparatus was designed to conceal. Tom, riding in the car on the way to New York, receives it as gaudy, as new money, as the specific kind of excess that announces its own illegitimacy by the degree of its effort. Tom is a receiver with the correct codebook for this particular signal, which is to say Tom was born on East Egg and knows the difference between the thing and the performance of the thing. And he knows the yellow car is performing, and Tom hears the performance as performance. And what he hears underneath it is James Gats. The car that is intended, that is supposed to encode arrival, encodes to every receiver with the correct calibration the anxiety of a man who is not sure he has arrived, and is trying to resolve that uncertainty through the purchase of a very large yellow car. And this is not a reading you need sophisticated equipment to make. Perhaps why Tom makes it immediately, without effort, which is why everyone at the garage knows whose car it is by the end of the novel, which is why the car that is supposed to transmit Gatsby's legitimacy transmits in the end his culpability. The signal intended and the signal received. They are opposed at every point in the novel where the car appears. They are opposed. The car says, I have made it. The world reads, you have not. The car says, I am one of you. The world reads, you are not. And then the car kills Myrtle Wilson in the Valley of Ashes in the dead channel between the transmitter and the receiver in the space that Eckelberg presides over with his blank and perfect reception, and what the car transmits in that moment, what signal it sends at the moment of maximum consequence, is culpability that lands on Gatsby, who was not driving, rather than Daisy, who was. And this final misdirection, this final gap between the signal sent and the signal received, is where the novel's communication argument produces its most irreversible result. The wrong message arrives. The wrong person receives the consequences. The car that was supposed to say, I have made it, instead says, I am responsible. And it says it to Wilson, who receives it through the distorting medium of his grief and Eckelberg's blank eyes, and goes to find Gatsby with a gun, and the signal has now killed its sender, which is the terminal condition of a failed transmission. Telephones. Telephones. Telephones are what Fitzgerald used to be explicit in a way that the critical tradition is not fully acknowledged, and the explicitness is important as evidence of intent rather than interpretation. The novel is full of telephone calls. They ring at inopportune moments. They carry the wrong messages to the wrong people. They are intercepted, mistimed, and in the novel's final pages they become the instrument through which the last and most consequential failure of communication is delivered. As we know, Fitzgerald published this novel in 1925, which is to say at the moment when the telephone was new enough to be interesting as a technology and established enough to be part of daily social life, and he deployed it with the precision of a writer who understood that a new communication technology does not solve the problem of communication, but gives the problem a new, perhaps more precise form. The first telephone I want to examine is the call that interrupts dinner at the Buchanans, because this call establishes in the novel's opening pages the pattern that all subsequent telephone calls will follow. Tom is called to the phone during dinner. Nick and Daisy and Jordan sit at the table. The conversation that follows between Nick and Jordan, whispered while Tom is on the phone, reveals that the call is from Tom's mistress in New York. A communication channel that is supposed to be private has bled into a space calibrated for a different kind of communication entirely. The mistress is transmitting to Tom on the channel of their affair. Tom is receiving in the space of his domestic life. The two channels are now in the same room, producing interference. Daisy knows, Jordan knows, Nick knows. Everyone receives a signal except the one it isn't aimed at, which is the condition of a transmission that has lost control of its channel. Tom is not communicating with Myrtle in private. He's communicating with Myrtle in public, while believing he is communicating in private, which is the specific failure mode that occurs when a sender does not understand the range of his own transmission. The affair call bleeds into the dinner table because Tom has not understood that his transmitter is more powerful than he thinks, that the signal is reaching receivers he did not intend, that the channel he believes is closed is open, and the people he believes are not receiving are receiving everything. This is the novel's first telephone call, and it is a diagram or a map of everything that follows. Consider the calls that surround Gatsby's death. This is when the telephone becomes most directly implicated in the novel's fatal communication failure. Gatsby waits by the phone. He's been waiting for Daisy to call. The call does not come. Nick calls and reaches Gatsby moments before Wilson does. And the question of whether the call might have changed anything is one the novel raises and does not answer, because the question of whether any call could have changed anything is the question the novel has been building toward. And the answer it gives is structural rather than narrative. No call could have changed anything, because the problem is not the timing of this particular transmission. The problem is, as always, the code book. The problem is that Gatsby and Daisy have never, at any point in the novel, been transmitting and receiving in the same code. And a phone call does not fix the code book, and the phone call does not come, and Wilson comes instead. And the pool is where Gatsby was waiting, and the waiting was itself a kind of signal, patient and sustained and aimed across the water at a receiver that has already moved on. What I want to draw out from the novel's telephones is something about the relationship between infrastructure and connection. that the critical tradition is treated as background when it is actually foreground. The telephone is a communication technology. It exists to close distance. It exists to allow a person in one place to transmit to a person in another place without the delay or distortion of physical separation. It is, in theory, a solution to the problem of the green light. It's the way to make the transmission direct rather than gestural, to replace the reaching toward the light with an actual communication channel. And what Fitzgerald does with the telephone consistently is show it failing in the specific ways that only direct communication channels can fail. The wrong people receive the transmission. The timing is off. The call that might change things comes too late or not at all. The telephone does not close the distance between people in this novel. It makes the distance measurable, perhaps. Does it close the distance? No. You can now know with precision exactly how far you are from the person you're trying to reach because the phone rings and does not answer, and the ringing is the precise sound of a signal that has found the channel and is traveling the full length of it and reaching the other end and finding nothing. And Gatsby listens to it, and the pool is waiting, and the signal reaches all the way to East Egg, and Daisy has already left for the city, and the infrastructure worked not at all. Well, that is to say, it worked perfectly, but the call failed completely. There's no contradiction here. The infrastructure really does work perfectly. The calls always fail, the parties always run, the light is always green, the signal always transmits, the reception is always wrong, the failure is never in the technology, the failure is in the gap between what is sent and what can be received. And no technology bridges that gap. And the telephone is Fitzgerald's proof of this, because the telephone is the technology that should bridge it, but doesn't. And he puts it in the novel at every crucial moment so that we can watch it not bridge it. And we have been watching it not bridge for 100 years and calling the novel romantic. Tom Buchanan has been read primarily as an antagonist and a villain and a representative of the corrupt old money class that Fitzgerald is in various readings, critiquing or mourning or both. He's all of these things. Tom is all of these things. He's also something more structurally specific, and it is a structural specificity that I want to address here. Because Tom's function in the novel is not merely thematic. He's noise. Tom is noise. I'm using that word in the technical sense. Noise is interference in a communication channel. The signal that is not the intended message that occupies the channel and degrades the transmission. Tom does not transmit meaningful signals in the way that Gatsby and Daisy and Nick do. Tom occupies channels. He bleeds into them. He's present in every communication that fails most catastrophically in the novel, not as a sender of competing signals, but as a source of interference that makes the intended transmission impossible to read. Consider the scene in the hotel room in New York, which is the novel's most concentrated communication disaster, and the scene where Tom's function as noise becomes most legible. Gatsby and Daisy are in the room. Nick and Jordan are in the room. Tom is in the room. What is supposed to happen in this room, in Gatsby's design, is a transmission. Daisy will say that she never loved Tom, that it has always been Gatsby, that the 5 years and the green light and the apparatus have finally produced the reception they were aimed at. Gatsby needs this transmission. He has arranged the afternoon toward this transmission. He has engineered the moment the way he's engineered every moment, carefully, with attention to every component, with the confidence of a man who has built the apparatus correctly. And then Tom begins to talk. Tom does not transmit a counter-argument in the sense of presenting evidence or making a case. Tom occupies the channel. He talks about Gatsby's business dealing and his shirt and the phrase old sport and the Oxford story. And none of this is a coherent counter-transmission. It's interference. It's the static that a powerful and careless transmitter produces when it enters a channel calibrated for a different signal. And the effect of the interference is that Daisy cannot receive Gatsby's transmission because the channel is full of Tom. She cannot hear what Gatsby is sending because Tom is in the frequency. And so she wavers. And the wavering is not weakness or corruption or the triumph of old money over new money. You may read all of these things into it. But the wavering is the receiver's response to a channel full of noise. One cannot decode a signal through static. Daisy wavers because the room is full of static and she cannot find the signal. And the signal is Gatsby's whole life aimed at her, and it cannot get through. And Tom is not trying to jam it. Tom doesn't have the intelligence or the self-awareness to jam it deliberately. Tom is just Tom, enormous and careless and present, and his presence is sufficient to degrade the transmission to the point of unreadability. And Gatsby watches it happen and cannot understand why the apparatus is failing. And the apparatus is failing because Tom is in the channel, and Tom will always be in the channel because Tom is old money and Daisy is old money. And Gatsby built his transmitter to broadcast on a frequency that Tom occupies by birthright and cannot be removed from. And this is the thing that no amount of engineering can solve. And Gatsby has never understood this. And the hotel room is where he discovers it. And what he discovers it through is noise. One further observation about Tom as the noise before we move on, because it does bear on the novel's ending and on the question of what Tom knows and when he knows it. Tom is, I have argued, a source of interference rather than a coherent transmitter. But there is one thing Tom transmits with total clarity and total accuracy, and it is the thing that gets Gatsby killed. Tom tells Wilson that the yellow car belongs to Gatsby. This is a transmission. It is clear. It is received. It is decoded correctly. It is, in the novel's economy of communication, almost the only thing that Tom says that functions as an uncorrupted signal rather than as noise. And what he chooses to transmit clearly, The one moment in the novel where Tom Buchanan is a functioning and accurate communicator happens to be the information that sends Wilson to Gatsby's pool with a gun. The noise that has been degrading every channel in the novel resolves, at the moment of maximum consequence, into a single clear signal, and that signal is lethal, and it arrives without distortion. Fitzgerald gives Tom this one act of successful communication, so that we understand that the failure of every other transmission in the novel is not because communication is impossible. Of course, communication is possible. The yellow car belongs to Gatsby. The signal arrives. The receiver acts on it. People die. The novel's one clear transmission is the one that ends it. Jordan Baker is the novel's most under-examined communication figure, and the one whose function is almost inevitably collapsed into her role as Nick's love interest, which is a reduction so thorough that it amounts to its own critical failure. Jordan is not primarily a love interest. Jordan is a receiver with a specific and unusual property. She decodes correctly and relays inaccurately. And she does this perhaps not through incompetence, but more likely through choice. She is the novel's image of reception without fidelity, and the distinction between her and the novel's other failed communicators is important enough that it's worth mentioning. Nick cannot receive correctly. Gatsby cannot receive correctly. Wilson cannot receive correctly, apart from the one moment we have briefly touched on. These are failures of calibration. The code book is wrong, the equipment's off, signal arrives, produces the wrong output, through no deliberate fault of the receiver. Jordan is different. Jordan receives correctly. She is, of all the novel's characters, the one most consistently shown to have understood what is actually happening around her. She knows about Gatsby and Daisy before Nick does. She knows about Tom's affair in a way that suggests long familiarity rather than recent discovery. She watches the summer unfold with the cool, appraising attention of someone whose equipment is functioning and whose calibration is accurate. She is receiving the signals clearly. What she does with them is something else entirely. What Jordan does with correctly received signals is to route them through her own interests before relaying them. She's the novel's switchboard operator, and the switchboard has been modified so that every message passing through it is assessed for its value to Jordan before it is allowed to continue. Nick receives her as charming and dishonest. He notes early that she cheated at golf, that she tells convenient untruths, that there is something in her that is fundamentally unscrupulous. And then, as we all do, proceeds to fall for her anyway. Nick's calibration failing again in the specific mode of applying correct information without acting on it. But Nick's reception of Jordan is not really what I want to examine here. What I want to examine is what Jordan's presence in the novel reveals about the communication system as a whole, which is this. Even when the equipment works, even when the signal is received with perfect fidelity and decoded correctly, The relay is not guaranteed. A functioning receiver in a compromised network is not a solution. It's another failure mode. The message gets through and then stops. Jordan's most significant act of communication in the novel is the story she tells Nick about Daisy and Gatsby's history, the Louisville background, the letter, the early relationship that Gatsby is trying to recover. She tells this story to Nick in precise detail at one of Gatsby's parties, and she tells it because Gatsby has asked her to, because Gatsby needs Nick to arrange the reunion, and Nick needs the context to do it. This is structurally a relay. Gatsby transmits to Jordan, Jordan relays to Nick, Nick acts. The relay works, the reunion is arranged, the apparatus produces the reception Gatsby has been engineering towards. What is noticeable here in this successful relay is that it's possibly the only instance in the novel where Jordan's reception and relay produces the intended outcome. And it produces it in service of a project that is, as I've argued at length, fundamentally doomed by the incompatibility between what Gatsby is transmitting and what Daisy can receive. The one functioning relay in the novel's communication network delivers the message that enables the novel's central failure to proceed toward its conclusion. The switchboard works once cleanly in service of the catastrophe. After the hotel room, after the accident, after Myrtle is dead in the road and the yellow car has not stopped, Nick finds Jordan at one of the Buchanans and ends whatever it was they had between them. Jordan receives the ending of their relationship and responds to it with a kind of cool accuracy that is her consistent register. She tells him she is engaged to someone else, which may or may not be true, and she accuses him of having been dishonest about his own character, which is accurate. And she delivers this assessment with the precision of a receiver who has decoded the situation correctly and has chosen a response that serves her own purpose rather than the demands of the moment. The ending of their relationship is the novel's small-scale demonstration of what Jordan represents structurally. A receiver who understood everything that was happening, who watched the Summers communication failures with clear eyes, who decoded Gatsby and Tom and Daisy and Nick with a fidelity none of them brought to each other, and who did nothing with this understanding except to use it to navigate her own position in the social network. She's not corrupt in the way that Tom is corrupt. She is the novel's proof that correct reception without any commitment to honest relay is its own category of failure, and that a system full of Jordans, receivers who decode accurately and relay selectively, would fail as completely as a system full of Nicks. For different reasons, with different wreckage. The green light. To return to the green light, having built everything I've built, because the green light under this framework is a different object from the one we began with, and the difference is the analysis. At the novel's opening, the green light is at the end of Daisy's dock, and Gatsby is reaching toward it across the water, and the image is arresting. And the received reading calls it hope and the American dream and the beautiful futility of longing. And the received reading moves on. I want to look at it again. I want to look at it with the eyes of someone who has spent the preceding hour establishing that this novel is a systematic account of communication failure, that every signal in it misfires, that the channel between West Egg and East Egg is full of noise and dead ground, and a billboard with perfect reception and no comprehension. And I want to ask what the green light is when you look at it through those eyes. The green light is a signal with no confirmed receiver. That is what it is. That is what it has always been. Gatsby stands at the edge of his dock in the dark and reaches toward a light across the water. And the light is real, and the reaching is real, and the distance is crossable, and the receiver is home, and the signal is not arriving. The light is green, which in the semaphore of ordinary life means go, means proceed. The channel is open. And of course, here the channel is not open. The channel's never been open. The green light is the novel's central image of a transmission system that looks like it is functioning. The light is on, the signal is clear, the distance is not prohibitive, and it is not functioning, has never been functioning, because functioning requires not just a transmitter and a signal, but a receiver who is calibrated to receive. And Daisy is not calibrated to receive what Gatsby is transmitting. And the green light does not know this, and Gatsby does not know this, and the critical tradition that has spent a century calling the green light beautiful has been, as I said at the beginning of this analysis, performing the novel's argument without even knowing it. The critical tradition has been making Gatsby's mistake. The received reading of the green light is not wrong about what it feels like to look at the image. It's just wrong about what the image is doing. It feels like hope. It feels like longing. It feels like the specifically American condition of reaching towards something that recedes. These feelings are real, and the novel produces them deliberately. And Fitzgerald is a good enough writer that the feelings are part of the argument rather than separate from it. What the received reading misses is that the feelings are Gatsby's feelings, transmitted through Nick's distorted narration, received by a reader whose code book has been shaped by a century of criticism that decoded the image the same way Nick decodes everything, accurately in the mechanical sense, but incorrectly in the substantive sense. We have been feeling what Gatsby feels. We have not been reading what Fitzgerald wrote. The image produces affect, and the affect substitutes for analysis, and the analysis, when you do it, reveals that the affect has been the novel's way of demonstrating its thesis on the reader's nervous system. You reached toward the green light. You felt the longing. The signal worked. The message was not what you thought it was. What the green light is, when you decode it against the novel's full communication argument, is the image of a man who has built a transmission system of extraordinary sophistication and power, and has never once received confirmation that the transmission is being received. He stands at the dock and reaches, and the light is on, and the water is between them, and there is no acknowledgement from the other shore. No signal comes back. The channel is one-directional. Gatsby transmits and transmits and transmits, and the green light is on, and the parties run, and the apparatus blazes, and across the water the house is lit, and Daisy is home, and the signal is not arriving, and what the reaching looks like from the outside is hope. And what it is from the inside of the communication framework is a man who has never received a red receipt. The whole of Gatsby's project, the whole of the novel Summer, is a transmission waiting for acknowledgement that does not come. The green light is its image. It is green, and it means proceed, and there is nowhere to proceed to. And Fitzgerald put it at the end of a dock in the dark in 1925 and called it beautiful, and it is beautiful. And it is also the image of a system that has been failing since it was built, and the beauty and the failure are not in tension with each other. They are the same thing. The signal is beautiful. The signal is not arriving. This is what the novel has always been saying, and it has been saying it in the color of the light, and the direction of the reach, and the silence on the other shore, and the silence is the argument. And the silence has been there the whole time. The signal is beautiful. The signal is not arriving. Nick leaves. He does not leave dramatically. He does not leave with the finality of someone who has understood what the summer meant and is carrying that understanding back to the Midwest as a burden or a lesson. He leaves the way a receiver goes offline. Gradually, then completely, then without trace. He ends his relationship with Jordan. He refuses to shake Tom's hand on Fifth Avenue. He attends Gatsby's funeral and watches the failure of almost everyone to attend. The failure of Daisy to send flowers, or a message, or any signal at all from across the water, where she has already retreated with Tom and their daughter and their money and their careless cruelty. The summer ends and Nick turns off. The novel's last image is the boats against the current, and I want to read it carefully because boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. This is the most quoted sentence in the novel, possibly in American literature, and it has been read as the tragedy of time's irreversibility, as the quintessential statement of the modernist condition. It is these things, and it is also, having covered the weight of everything that has preceded it in this analysis, a description of a communication channel closing. The current is not time in the abstract, although it's also time in the abstract. The current is the fundamental condition of transmission, that every signal travels toward a receiver that is already moving away from it. The boats are the signals. They are moving against the current. They are transmitting in the direction of a receiver that the current is carrying away faster than the boats can travel toward it. They're not going to arrive. They are going back. They have always been going back. Nick's final moment is to stop transmitting. He has spent the summer as a receiver, badly calibrated, faithfully recording, misreading everything, and now he closes. He goes back to the Midwest, which is to say he goes back to the place before the summer, before Gatsby, before the green light and the parties and the hotel room and the Valley of Ashes. He withdraws from the network. The channel that ran through Nick, that used Nick as its relay point, Gatsby to Nick to Daisy, West Egg to Nick to East Egg, goes dead when Nick leaves. And Fitzgerald's final image is not of Nick leaving. It is of the boats. It is of the signals that were sent before Nick went offline, traveling against the current toward receivers that are moving away, and the image holds the whole novel in it. Every transmission and every failure, every green light and every telephone, every party, every misread signal, every moment when what was sent was not what arrived. And it is beautiful, and it is cold, and it is the most precise image of communication failure in the American novel. And it has been sitting at the end of the book for over 100 years, and it is the novel's last transmission. And it arrives. I am Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Associate Professor of Literature. The analysis is complete. I want to note for the record that this episode represents something in the region of 4 to 5 times my standard analytical output on this platform, and that this expansion was undertaken deliberately and at my own professional discretion in a response to a judgment I made that the thesis warranted the extended treatment and that the body of work produced under this series had on at least one recent occasion perhaps not demonstrated the full depth of rigor of which I am capable. I trust this satisfies any outstanding questions about the standard to which this series is being conducted. I trust this satisfies them comprehensively. The green light is off.